Elevator stop 13. That floor doesn't exist. The elevator hummed with that familiar, low mechanical purr, the kind you stop noticing after the first few floors. Numbers glowed above the door, ticking up with steady certainty. 7, 8, 9. The ride was supposed to be short, routine, the kind of transition you never remember. Elevators exist to erase distance, not to create it. The building itself was one of those older towers that had been refitted to look modern without fully erasing its age. A new lobby, polished steel, recessed lighting that smelled faintly of disinfectant and taint. But the bones were old. You could feel it, in the slow shudder when the doors closed, in the slightly uneven vibration of the floor as the cables carried you upward. People don't think about cables when they ride. They think about where they're headed. But anyone who has ever stood long enough in that hum knows the cables are always reminding you that you're being pulled. By the time the display blinked 10, the air inside the car had already shifted. It wasn't temperature, not exactly, more like the subtle pressure drop you feel before a storm. The ceiling light flickered once, casually, as if stretching. The metal handrail along the back panel felt cool, almost damp when my fingers brushed it. Small things, nothing alarming. Elevators are always misbehaving in little ways, and passengers forgive them because the alternative is walking 14 flights. Except there weren't 14 flights. The building directory had been clear. 12 occupied levels, ground floor lobby, rooftop access by a separate stairwell. 12 neat numbers, nothing more. Everyone knew it because everyone knew the superstition that lingers in architecture. No 13th floor. Hotels skip it. Offices rename it. Towers pretend the space between 12 and 14 simply doesn't exist. It's an old sleight of hand to appease fears, or at least to market calm to tenants who don't want unlucky digits attached to their leases. The panel above the door didn't agree. The ascent slowed between 12 and what should have been 14. The car gave a low mechanical sigh, a shift in rhythm that told the body something had gone off script. The digital display blinked, and there it was. 13. A number no tenant had rented, no lease had ever listed, no architect had supposedly built. For a second, the brain filed it as error, faulty panel, lazy maintenance, maybe a technician punched the wrong code. But the elevator didn't correct itself. It stopped. The weight settled into the soles of my shoes, that dense stillness of machinery at rest. The hum died, leaving only the faint buzz of fluorescent lighting above. The doors did not open. Silence in an elevator isn't real silence. It's the sound of absence, the cables no longer moving, the counterweight stilled, the echo of air suddenly trapped with you. You notice things you normally ignore, the scuff marks at ankle height, the smear of fingerprints around the emergency button, the faint smell of grease mixed with stale perfume from 100 riders before. You notice how small the space really is when you measure it not in square feet, but in breaths.
The panel glowed steady. 13. Time behaves strangely when machinery fails. 30 seconds feel like 5 minutes. A minute feels like 10. Logic offers up simple fixes. Press door open, press close, press lobby. Fingers press, lights blink obligingly. Nothing moves. The call button lights red, holds, then fades again. The speaker above it crackles but gives no voice. The elevator remains indifferent. That's when the questions start sneaking in. Not about repair times or maintenance schedules, but about the architecture itself. If there is no 13th floor, what does it mean to stop at 13? If the building denies it exists, where are these doors facing? Behind the metal, is there drywall? Is there air? Or is there a hidden corridor that no blueprint admits, a floor built in silence for reasons nobody names? The air pressed closer. Elevators are ventilated, but stillness makes them feel sealed. Every breath seemed louder, every exhale heavier. My reflection in the steel door looked thinner, longer, as though stretched by the panel's slight curve. The overhead light hummed faintly, but not steadily. It had adopted a rhythm, a slow pulse, like a second heart beating just above my head. The handrail was colder now. Touching it sent a shiver not just across skin, but deeper, a kind of metallic echo that lingered in the bones. The urge to call out, to ask if anyone outside could hear, rose quickly, then died just as fast. Elevators mute sound. Even if voices carried, who exactly was listening? Minutes, or something that felt like minutes, passed. The panel never changed. 13 glowed with unblinking patience. The thought arrived uninvited, as all terrifying thoughts do. Maybe the elevator hadn't stopped at all. Maybe it was kept moving so slowly that the body couldn't measure the motion. Maybe it wasn't resting between 12 and 14, but drifting somewhere else entirely, some space that borrowed the number 13 because no one had claimed it. A ghost floor, a margin of error in the architecture of the world. And if it was still moving, upward or downward, how far would it travel before anyone noticed the discrepancy? The silence didn't break. It deepened.
The elevator decided before I did. A cough of hydraulics, a reluctant sigh of metal, and the doors parted with the soft stubbornness of something opening against its better judgment. The panel above them held its ground, 13, unwavering, a single digit daring the building to contradict it. A thin slice of hallway appeared, the kind of liminal strip that every elevator reveals first. Threshold metal, a seam of carpet, a wall that tells you the palette before it tells you the purpose. The air on the other side felt cooler by a degree that only skin would notice. Not winter cold, not draft cold, but storage cold. The temperature of rooms that are maintained for function rather than comfort. The scent carried a blend no lobby designer would choose. Dust warmed by recessed fixtures, diluted solvent, the faint mineral bite of unrun plumbing. Nothing dramatic. No blood, no rot, no theatrical fog. Just the wrong collection of ordinary smells for a floor that claimed not to exist. Habit put one foot over the threshold while the other foot kept the elevator's world. Instinct preferred a tether. That cable hum, absent now, had felt like a hand on the back. Without it, the room beyond looked like a stage designed by someone who collected office parks for a hobby. Beige walls wearing a fresh coat that didn't quite hide the seams. Baseboards a shade darker than the carpet, as if hoping to anchor the eye. A corridor that ran straight then made a modest corporate turn to the right. Ceiling tiles unmarred, except for one off-center panel with a shadowed stain shaped more like a smudge than an event. The doors made their expectant pause, then began their automatic retreat toward closure. The body reacted before thought, a shoulder to the jamb, a palm against the cool inner edge. The elevator resisted, without malice, as if obeying a rule rather than enforcing one. For a second, the motor whirred its tiny protest. Then it gave me another beat, as if conceding a stalemate to a passenger who needed a staircase of moments rather than a cliff. It would have been easy to stay inside and play for rescue. Press the phone icon, recite location, and wait for assurance that a technician was en route. But this particular panel had already lied about reality, and I had no appetite for a conversation with a speaker that might connect to nowhere. Outside, at least, there would be walls I could touch and a ceiling that wouldn't drop suddenly. Outside offered choices, even if only the illusion of them.
The foot followed the foot. The elevator let the doors close with a restrained gratitude, as if relieved to be allowed to complete a cycle. The cab's mirrored interior held my outline for an instant, and then replaced it with its own reflection, an empty box lit like a laboratory. The indicator above continued to insist on 13, as though proud of its rebellion. The corridor absorbed me without ceremony. Sound changed the way it always does once you leave a mechanical room. Everything went flatter, more carpeted. The lights were bright enough to banish shadow, but not bright enough to feel cheerful. LED strips at a color temperature that pretended to be natural and almost got away with it. The carpet had a pattern that looked like a decision made by committee. Gray fields interrupted by thinner gray lines, a geometry precise enough to be measurable. The lines did not align perfectly at the seam near the elevator, a small misregistration, the kind any contractor might shrug at on a Thursday afternoon. The eye caught it and then agreed to forget. Hallways announce their purpose if you wait long enough. This one kept withholding. No art, no framed evacuation maps, no glass plaque with tenant names in fonts that match their brand books. Just a series of closed doors, each with a brushed metal plate where numbers should have been. Not blank, emptied. The adhesive ghosts of numerals remained, paler rectangles within the rectangle, as if names had once existed and then been rubbed out with care. The doors had peepholes, with no glass, little black nulls. On the wall opposite the elevator, a thermostat idled with its digital smile frozen at 13 degrees Celsius. Any other number would have floated past the mind like a cloud. That one planted a flag. Beside it, a wall clock held a shiny white face and hands that had chosen 113 and decided time was a painting. The seconds hand did not tremble.
The clock had been wired, because that's the kind this building bought, but the wiring had been swallowed by the wall as if the corridor had eaten its own power supply and left the decorations unfed. Phones become talismans in moments like this. Mine found itself in my palm before I could remember taking it out. Battery percentage read 13. The cellular icon showed bars that meant nothing. LTE sat there like a sticker. Wi-Fi offered up a list of networks with names that belonged to other floors. Conference rooms, tenant offices, a cafe, and yet every signal measured as strong, every lock icon present, every connect spinning into a polite refusal. The time on the phone matched the wall clock for a heartbeat, then leapt forward 3 minutes, then returned to its original assertion as if embarrassed to have wandered. Down the corridor, an exit sign glowed with the confidence that only fire code grants. The arrow pointed right toward the corporate turn. I started toward it, counting steps the way people count steps when hallways are long. One side of the carpet's thin line for even numbers, the other side for odd. At 13, the exit sign refused to get closer. The arrow held its place at the same measured distance, as if mounted on the far end of a treadmill I had not consented to tread.
The trick was not new in itself. Anyone who has walked toward a mirror when tired has watched scale disobey. But mirrors were not present. The corridor had no glass except the dead eyes in the door peepholes. The walls weren't parallel 100 feet out. They were here, 4 feet away on either side, and their texture did not recede. The carpet changed underfoot each time a seam crossed, proof that distance was actually being eaten. The exit sign merely practiced refusal. Turning back sometimes helps. The elevator would still be there with its stubborn panel. The hallway behind me remained exactly as it had been, except for one difference too small to dignify as a change. The misregistered carpet seam near the elevator had moved 1 tile farther from the doors. A tile was not a unit of time, but my brain chose to treat it as such. The elevator did not wait. The doors had sealed the moment I stepped away. The call button on the hall panel was a round, backlit dot with a small crease where thousands of fingers had pressed it. I pressed mine. The dot stayed lit. The doors stayed closed. Inside, silence performed competence. The corridor still offered the right-hand turn, so I took it because doing nothing was more frightening than moving, and because exits make promises that corridors sometimes keep. The turn led to another straight segment, with the same neutral palette, the same thermostats set to the same impolite number, the same array of emptied door plates. One door bore a small rectangular magnet in the position where a suite number would go. The magnet displayed no text. It did not pretend. It simply occupied. Halfway down, a recessed niche held what every office floor hosts as a courtesy to thirst: a water fountain, stainless steel, modern design, bottle filler attachment included. The filler sensor winked its little green dot, a sign of life. The fountain button depressed smoothly under my thumb and stayed down with the satisfying resistance of a well-sprung mechanism. Nothing came out. The bottle filler stared at the bottle-shaped absence in front of it and offered the same green dot. A placard above it, the kind that usually says "filtered" or "stay hydrated," had been installed blank. The screwheads were unscratched, brand new, chosen specifically to display a sign that refused to sign. The exit sign at the end of this stretch wanted me to turn again, left this time, as if the corridor were teaching me a dance I hadn't learned in the lobby. I followed. Another stretch, another set of empty doors, another clock at 1:13 that had chosen stillness over function. Each corner brought a mild hope and a perfectly reasonable disappointment. The floor plan could have wrapped the building core, circling elevators and mechanical shafts the way most rectangular towers do. It could have been routine. Routine did not place 3 identical maintenance closets at equidistant points with the same padlock model and the same metal tags stamped M13.
The first closet rattled when touched, not like a door but like a cage. The second warmed the air by a breath, as if a machine the size of a large animal lived behind it. The third carried a sound so faint that the ear wasn't sure it deserved attention. A tap, not quite rhythmic, almost timid, if that is a word that can be applied to sound. The kind of tap that drywall makes when pipes behind it expand and contract with temperature, except the thermostat insisted on 13 degrees Celsius, a number that does not invite expansion. There were no office voices, no printers working through a ream, no HVAC rushing to keep people comfortable. Yet the floor was not dead. It lived in the way abandoned spaces live, with systems set to maintenance mode, with cycles that keep mold and entropy at bay, with the ticking of things designed to tick.
The stairwell door near the third maintenance closet wore the red-lettered promise that all stair doors wear: exit with the vaguely comforting push-bar hardware below. The bar yielded. The door opened on a stairwell painted industrial white. The smell of concrete made itself known, the chalk of it and the damp. The acoustics shifted to stairwell acoustics, magnifying breath, compressing footfalls into tight echo. The landing sign, which on other floors would say 12 or 14, had been installed with a white square in the number's place. No marker pen had been tempted. No hand had corrected it later. The white square just sat there, a dental filling where a tooth should have been. Up seemed as reasonable as down. Up meant 14 or roof access or both. Down meant lobby and relief. The choice was not complicated. Down gained gravity's cooperation. I began descending, counting steps like children do when they race siblings on summer staircases. 13 to the next landing, because some architect decades ago liked 9s and 4s. The landing offered a door matching the one I had left. Exit in red, push bar, white square where reality owed a number. The door swung open onto a corridor that was itself. Same carpet seam misaligned in the same place, same thermostat at the same impolite number, same water fountain niche with a green dot promising liquid that would not appear. Back into the stairwell, down again. 13 steps. Another door with another white square where someone should have committed to Arabic numerals. Same corridor, same empty door plates. The body registered fatigue in tiny ways, the way calves complain when repetition refuses to justify itself, the way lungs decide that even cool air is not incentive enough. Down one more, because stubbornness and fear often race each other wearing the same shirt. 13 steps, door, corridor, thermostat grin. Up them, because sometimes you decide the only way to answer a maze is to violate its request. 13 steps, door, corridor. The exit sign pointed left this time where previously it had pointed right, but the rotation produced the same geometry 100 feet later. If there was a center, it was locked behind those maintenance doors, or it did not exist.
Phones have ways of negotiating with locked systems. Mine offered its usual tricks: the compass app, the level that uses accelerometers, the developer mode that normal people do not need. The compass spun with politeness and landed on 13 degrees east for a second, and then apologized by becoming a question mark. The level declared the floor perfectly flat, even as my knees told me it pitched slightly downhill toward the blank magnet door. The battery percentage slid from 13 to 12, and then back to 13 without charge or drain, the way numbers flicker on gas pumps when the mechanism behind the digits can't agree. At one of the corners, the corridor widened into a waiting area designed by a catalog. 2 chairs, too upright for comfort, a low table, too low for utility, a plant that had either been watered recently or had never been alive. A framed landscape hung askew above the table, the kind of mass-printed lake scene that exists by the thousands. The glass over it reflected the ceiling light without showing me. Not invisibility, misalignment. Move left, and the reflection lagged by a fraction. Move right, and it corrected in a stutter, as if streaming a version of the corridor a half-second delayed. The elevator indicator at the far end showed 13 in the reflection, even if I looked at it straight on and tried to trick the brain into catching it on 12 or 14. Footsteps eventually found their way into this quiet. Not heavy footsteps, not sprinting rescues. Measured, carpet-dulled rhythm from a distance that vacillated between closer and further without committing to either. They approached the way rain approaches in dreams, always audible, never arriving. Turning a corner to meet them produced only another stretch of empty corridor. Looking back meant watching the waiting area remain where it had been, chairs and table unoccupied, plant non-committal. A surveillance camera bulged from the ceiling near the elevator bank. The dome was opaque, the kind that never conceals its cheapness. A tiny green LED blinked behind the plastic. Cameras offer comfort when they connect to something bigger than the hallway. This one blinked to itself like a lighthouse on a fog bank that had no ships. Far down the corridor, past a carpet seam that agreed with itself, a second elevator announced its existence. Not a twin to the first, narrower, with brushed steel that had accepted more scratches. The call button was an older model, the kind with an incandescent bulb behind a frosted circle. Pressing it lit the circle with the warmth that the modern buttons never manage. The indicator above this door held no numbers. Instead, it displayed a small horizontal slit that glowed when the car was in motion. The slit glowed now. The car moved somewhere. That did not reveal a direction. When the doors of the second elevator parted, they did so with the confident speed of a service machine. The interior had a higher ceiling.
a handrail that wrapped 3 sides, a floor that traded carpet for ribbed rubber. The control panel was a vertical grid of square buttons with translucent caps. Floors arranged predictably from 1 to 12, a jumped gap labeled 14, and a bottom row given to basements and mechanicals. The 13 position was not blank. It had a button cap in place, unlit, lightly scuffed, indistinguishable except for the smallest notch in its plastic, as if someone had pried at it once and given up. The legend beside the grid offered the usual list: L for lobby, R for roof with a key icon, M for mechanicals, and a narrow caution at the bottom in print so small it wanted to be ignored. Unauthorized floors restricted.
The door began its reverse countdown toward closure. The choice was the same shape it had been by the first cab. Stay outside, accept corridors that repeat until repetition rewrites sense. Step in, accept a box whose entire job is to move, even when it pretends it can't. The handrail's metal promised something to grip. The rubber floor promised traction. The mind, desperate for forward motion, decided that up and down were easier negotiations than left and right. Inside, the air felt cleaner. The fan above the lights moved it properly. The doors closed, and the world shrank to a rectangle that had memorized more versions of fear than any room should. The panel waited for a finger to teach it an intention. The lobby would be mercy. 12 would be a confession. 14 would be a fiction. The fingertip hovered. The 13 button did not light when touched. It accepted the pressure the way sand accepts a heel, yielding, then holding the imprint. The panel remained calm. The slit above the door glowed brighter for a breath, then steadied. The car did not move. The lobby button glowed immediately, an obedient child. The car did not move. 14 glowed next, sharing its polite light with the lobbies, both of them offering little halos that might have been reassurances if not for the stubborn lack of motion underfoot. The emergency stop switch sat behind a little plastic cover that snapped open with more eagerness than was appropriate. The switch itself felt new. Pulling it would do nothing useful. It existed to test the kind of person who presses red buttons because red buttons exist. The elevator made a sound then, not a chime, a brief descending tone like an inverted doorbell, as if reversing the idea of arrival. The slit's glow dimmed and then strengthened, and the sensation of weight changed by the fraction that says a machine has chosen to engage. The car began to move with a smoothness that belonged to the rest of the building, not to the corridor outside. It did not announce direction. The panel did not tell. The floor indicator that should have been numbers flickered and offered a compromise. A single slender dash where numbers would appear, then 2 dashes, then 1 again, then 3. The order did not map to ascent or descent. It mapped to insistence. 1, 2, 1, 3. The brain, given a pattern, always looks for a story to staple to it. A story wasn't available. A floor was. When the doors opened again, they opened onto a hallway that matched the one I had left, but that carried a difference the body clock felt before the eyes claimed it. The air tasted warmer by a degree too small for thermostats. The clocks, where they existed, had all chosen 3:13 instead of 1:13. The exit sign at the nearest corner pointed in both directions, with the same kind of confidence that makes arguments lose interest in themselves. The elevator behind me held its doors open, a patient mouth, and the panel had stopped offering glow as counsel. The 13 button, which had refused to light, looked slightly more worn now than it had a minute ago, as if I had pressed it longer than memory admitted.
There was movement then, finally, in the far distance. A door at the end of the corridor opened half an inch and then settled again, the way doors do when pressure differentials flirt with their edges. No footstep followed, no voice asked or answered, just the whisper of a building's lungs adjusting to whatever I had just brought into its secret room. The elevator let the doors begin their close, a courteous warning measure. Stepping forward to stall them would be a declaration. Allowing them to seal would be another. The decision assembled itself the way decisions do when options all lead deeper. The foot lifted. The corridor received it. The doors continued their efficient kiss and met with not a stutter, but a seal. Behind me, a machine prepared to pretend it was gone. Ahead, a floor that no lease acknowledged waited,
unbothered by my small inventory of rules. The thermostat smiled its number. The clocks held their new time. The exit signs did not care which side I chose. I started walking towards the door that had moved.
The handle was ordinary brushed steel, smudged faintly as though hundreds of palms had touched it. But my fingers recognized a difference before I registered it. Warmth. Not residual, not the kind a handle collects after a colleague leaves a conference room. This warmth carried pulse. I pulled, and the door yielded without squeak or complaint, as if it had always been waiting for me rather than resisting anyone else. Behind it, no office welcomed, no conference table, no copy machine humming against deadlines. The room stretched further than geometry allowed. The first impression was of vacancy, an unfinished floor where architects had left their outlines without committing to paint. Bare concrete, pillars rising at intervals like ribs, fluorescent fixtures hanging in rows too precise to have been improvised, and yet light refused to saturate. Each fixture glowed with loyalty, but shadows huddled in the angles between columns as though they had leased the space first. The air tasted heavier here, less filtered, more elemental, metallic on the tongue, like holding a coin. Somewhere, water dripped with metronomic patience. I stepped farther in, noting the scuff of rubber soles on dust that no janitor's mop had disturbed in years. At the far end stood windows. That alone was wrong. The building's exterior promised glass walls on every office level, but these windows were taller, broader, wrong in proportion. The city outside wore its lights at angles that did not match memory. Streets bent as though observed through a lens that liked distortion more than fidelity. Yellow lamps smeared like brush strokes, red taillights froze too long before dissolving, and the silhouettes of buildings refused to align with their bodies. I looked down. The dust at my feet told a story of others who had walked here. Shoeprints overlapped, layered, dragged. Some crisp, some blurred as if the concrete itself tried to erase them. They moved in no clear direction. A cluster led to a pillar, and then stopped, as if absorbed. Another set circled until the arcs frayed into chaos. I knelt and touched one. The dust shifted too easily, not like neglect, but like deliberate scattering. The drip continued. It came from no visible pipe. Each sound carried too long, echoing in ways that implied distance the room did not physically own. The ceiling above looked unbroken, flawless. Still, the drip persisted, timed so evenly it might have been metronome or heartbeat. The exit behind me was still there. The door I had entered through remained propped half open, light from the corridor leaking its bland glow into this unfinished cathedral. For a breath, retreat proposed itself. The air changed when it sensed the proposal, warmer by a degree, as if the room exhaled at the thought of being abandoned.
Something clattered. Not loud, not near. A coin, a key, an object that rolled once and settled. Shadows did not move, but silence rearranged. The body mapped exits that did not belong to the plan. Windows that would not open, pillars that would not conceal, a door that might close without permission. Breath became inventory. In, count, out, count. Panic multiplies, control subtracts. Step by step, I moved toward the sound. Nothing lay on the floor except dust, but dust parted in a way that suggested an object had slid, then been lifted. A curved track without termination, as though invisible fingers had reclaimed what they dropped. A vibration rippled through the pillars. Not earthquake. Not machinery. Resonance, like a tuning fork pressed into bone. The fixtures overhead flickered in sympathetic rhythm, a pattern that repeated 13 times and then steadied. The skyline beyond the long panes had changed in the interim. Floors lit wrong, desks arranged in configurations I had not seen earlier. The building across was the same and not the same. Then the prints moved. Not all at once, not theatrically. A smudge lengthened. A heel mark dragged an inch. One set that had halted halfway to the wall continued, step by slow step, elongating without weight, advancing toward the windows.
I backed away without turning. Spectacle felt like invitation. The door waited behind, still cracked. Between me and it stood pillars, marks, and an air tilted against retreat. A bell spoke from somewhere inside the walls. Not this room's pitch, but the building's. An elevator had announced arrival. The moving prints hesitated. The drip ceased. The attention of the floor shifted, like an animal scenting. Momentum returned to the body. One step, then another, then a measured run. The door surrendered. The corridor swallowed me back. Fluorescent lights steadied. Thermostats grinned their impossible number. Behind, the unfinished room closed itself with a click that echoed like a lock. At the end of the hall, an elevator waited that belonged to maintenance more than to tenants. Narrower doors, off-white panels, a call button already lit. The exit sign over the stair flickered between left and right as if undecided. The handle burned with current, not flame, branding memory into palm. The elevator opened onto dark that absorbed rather than reflected. A single panel glowed on the far wall. Numbers unlabeled, a vertical row of amber circles. The hallway dimmed by degrees, not by bulbs dying, but by surfaces surrendering their light inward. Outside no longer offered refuge. Forward did. Dust prints had followed me out of the unfinished room. I had not seen them form, but they were present now. Arcs tracked onto the patterned carpet, some alongside my path, some ahead of it, entering the waiting car before I had chosen. I stepped in. The doors closed. The car began to descend.
The descent had texture. Not the clean glide of a polished tower, not the judder of freight, a slow, deliberate lowering as if each inch required approval. The fan above did not move air, it moved awareness. Seconds took shapes and sat beside me, patient as clerks. The panel's amber circles brightened one by one and then retreated, not counting down, but circling in a rhythm that refused translation. Somewhere within the walls, a faint tick insisted on 13-beat intervals. The body wanted integers. The box offered pulses. The phone woke and slept in a loop that ignored touch. Notifications arrived as blank banners and left without explanation. Battery climbed beyond plausibility and fell below survival, then corrected as if embarrassed to be noticed. The camera opened to perfect black, not absence, but occupation. With nowhere to look but inward, the mind invented metaphors. The car felt like a capsule sinking through redacted memory, descending past layers where context had been stripped away. Offices vanished first, then names, then the lobby's pretense. Beneath all that, service corridors and machine rooms endured without asking permission. Under those, permissions themselves. The car paused once, briefly, without doors. Air pressure shifted by half a breath. Outside, something existed that objected to adjacency. The pause lasted 13 seconds by a civilian count, and then surrendered. When the doors finally opened, they did so without chime. Polished concrete replaced carpet, painted cinder block replaced beige drywall, disciplined conduit replaced ornamental baseboard. The temperature settled into institutional cool, meant for servers, not people. A single strip light buzzed like an insistent wasp. A red stencil labeled a door with a code that belonged to a manual no tenant would read. The code included a number that should not have existed. Paint bled at the edges, as if the wall protested its assignment. I stepped out. The elevator held its breath, doors open, patient as a mouth. This level refused politeness. Buildings are organs here. Conduit as nerves, ducts as lungs, codes as bones. Somewhere a compressor cycled, somewhere a relay clicked. Dust carried ozone as a partner. A camera faced the cab. Its dome was clear, its indicator steady. The sensation of being noticed replaced the cliché of being watched. Presence had been entered into a ledger. Two directions presented themselves. To the left, air moved with purpose. To the right, it hung. The left-hand floor bore faint double tracks, the path of a cart. I followed the implication of destination. A door ahead stood ajar by less than a finger's width. Air whispered through the seam with the patience of sleeping things. The room beyond arranged itself like a thesis on maintenance. Workbench, pegboard, coils of cable hung with pride, boxes labeled in punctual capitals. On the bench lay a stack of laminated cards clipped by a ring. Each card contained a floor diagram. Some bore familiar numbers, some carried the number that was not supposed to exist. The diagrams differed in ways that implied revision rather than error. Stairwells connected where they should not. Elevators bypassed levels that never received tenants. The forbidden card depicted a corridor like mine and a central space bounded by symbols that wanted to be hatch marks and almost were. The legend had been left blank, as if hoping meaning would arrive later. A logbook lay open beside the cards. The last entry ended mid-line at a time that repeated its digits. The handwriting surrendered its neatness letter by letter into pressure. The pen's final stroke drilled into paper hard enough to emboss pages beneath. The indentation felt like a fingerprint preserved by compulsion. The hum in the walls gained a note. The ceiling fan ticked once. A monitor on a shelf woke and showed nothing but the number denied upstairs, repeating across the screen in a grid until pixels surrendered coherence and became shimmer. Movement lived at the edge of vision. The camera in this room had no dome, just an exposed eye. It adjusted focus on absence, then on me, then beyond me, as if recording residue. A frame later, the monitor replaced its field of digits with the elevator I had left open and no passenger in sight. The timestamp matched and did not match. Air shifted from the direction of the cab. The open doors flexed inward and held. Borrowed time declared itself. The path to the right, where the air had hung, now carried a draft that smelled faintly of lobby citrus. Following it would mean chasing a promise. Staying would mean reading a system that refused readers. I chose the draft. The corridor narrowed and bent twice, the kind of bends that make fire codes nervous. The floor changed to a surface designed to forgive slips. A drain in the center collected nothing. Overhead, a strip of lights flickered exactly 13 times and then steadied. The signature had returned. The door at the end wore a sign printed with what might have been the building's name once, and a number that had been scraped off and painted over. The paint could not decide whether to match. The handle cooled the skin where the stair bar had burned it. Touching it felt like touching coin again. The latch yielded. Beyond, another elevator lobby waited, compact, bare, a cube without chairs or art. Two cars faced each other across speckled tile. One was the maintenance cab I had left down the hall, except it was also here. The other was a twin whose panel offered a single button with no label, just a shallow crescent notch. Pressing it would be a handshake with something that disliked words.
The maintenance car chimed, a simple acknowledgement. Its doors began to close without me. The twin held still, the notch patient. Somewhere, above or below, a bell answered itself in 13 echoes that refused to fade correctly. The draft reversed, the lights brightened by a measurable whisper. I pressed the notch. The twin opened. Inside, the panel contained one decision. No numbers, no keys, no polite stand-ins. Only the notch, duplicated, inset. The rubber floor had no scuffs. The handrail had no oils. The car felt prepared, but uninitiated. I stepped in because the alternative looked like living in the corridor. The doors closed at a pace that refused theater. Weight pressed gently into ankles and climbed the spine. A familiar lift inverted into descent. The ceiling light dimmed until edges softened. The fan turned without moving air. The panel pulsed once under my palm and cooled. The car moved more decisively than before, gliding with a confidence that declared destination without naming it. Ears popped, stomach adjusted. The number the building denied assembled itself behind the eyes, not as a digit on a display, but as an address lodged in bone. Mind rejected, body filed. When motion ceased, the pause had gravity. The doors did not open immediately. Pressure equalized. A relay committed. The seam widened by a width that measured the thickness of choice. The car had delivered me where the building insisted no floor existed. Behind me, the elevator waited with patient calculation.
The seam widened until it forgot it was a seam. Pressure equalized, a small weather system finishing its argument. I waited for the chime that buildings use to announce arrivals to themselves. None came. The doors completed their deliberate separation and revealed a lobby that had never been designed for tenants. Rooms meant for people collect signals of hospitality without trying. Mats, benches, a smear of art installed at eye height to pretend generosity. This place had one purpose only: to be the room between a machine and whatever the machine had been told to hide. The floor was polished concrete, swept to the edge of invisibility. The walls were not drywall, not cinder block, not stone. They wore a finish that looked like paint applied to memory. The light overhead was a rectangle without fixture, a brightness emitted by ceiling itself, indifferent and generous in the way of operating rooms and bank vaults. The air tasted like solved math. No citrus, no lobby perfume, no trace of dinners being ferried up to tired desks. Ozone filtered through something colder than filtration. Skin noticed the absence of dust before eyes proved it. Sound sheltered behind surfaces, then returned politely when footsteps asked. There were doors, but they did not pretend to be offices. 3 across on the left, 3 across on the right, spaced as evenly as vertebrae. Each door wore a brushed plate bigger than a nameplate and smaller than a sign. Each plate was blank except for a hairline groove circling its edge, as if waiting for a coin to pry it loose. The handles were identical siblings of the stair bar that had burned, but these were cool. The elevator at my back held its doors open with the patience of a morgue drawer. Straight ahead was a wall that was not a wall, a pane of something translucent but not proud enough to be glass. Behind it lived a light different from the ceilings, paler, thinner, like milk under water. It promised depth without offering shape. A thin metallic seam ran vertical down its center, a zipper without teeth. The urge to press a palm against that surface arrived and waited, the way certain impulses announce themselves as options even before they can claim to be ideas. Clocks had been the tricksters on every level. Here, there wasn't one. Not a single dial, not a digital grin with a frozen colon. The absence created its own time. My phone, obedient to none of this, pulsed its insistence in the corner. 1313, a format it had never shown before. Battery held at a number that had learned to mock arithmetic and sat there like a dare. The compass offered a dot, centered on nothing. The leftmost door yielded to a handle that asked nothing in return. The space beyond was narrow and bright, the size of an old file room. Shelves lined both sides, not stacked high, but built to stop just below shoulder level, a height chosen for looking rather than lifting. The shelves did not hold boxes. They held single objects precisely spaced. A keycard without logo, a transit token from a system that never took coins, a thin gold ring scuffed at one point where a life had caught it, a folded paper program stained once with something that chose not to be identified, a hospital bracelet cut and taped back together with a stranger's care. Each object sat on a square of frosted acrylic, and beneath each square glowed a light that faded before it could call itself illumination.
The labels that should have explained were absent. In their place, a small notch cut into the shelf at the front of each square, identical to the notch on the elevator panel. Not quite a finger hole, not quite a keyway. The room sounded like a library whose books refused to be read aloud. Across the hall, the matching room offered different objects obeying the same display. A phone case with a heat-warped edge, a scrap of cardstock printed with a date and a time and a place that a person had not reached, a parking stub stamped twice, a satin ribbon cut short, the kind florists use to convince celebration to behave. The urge to arrange narratives over these was immediate and unhelpful. The mind wants a museum. The building had built a pantry. The third door on the left refused at first and then changed its mind. A tiny courtesy offered a fraction too late. Inside, the shelves held no objects at all, only their squares, lit and empty as if awaiting deliveries that no courier could sign for. The acrylic surfaces bore faint arcs of dust where something had once rested. The lows of the arcs did not match the heights of any object I anticipated. Whatever had sat here had been not quite flat and not quite round, as if a shape had insisted on being counted without declaring itself a category. Back in the central lobby, the milky wall displayed a trick of parallax. Approach from the left, and the light behind it cooled. Approach from the right, and it warmed. Stand dead center, and the vertical seam asserted itself like a spinal cord. Every nerve in the building had ended here. The whispers of motors, of compressors, of air balancing through ductwork, each gathered to listen at this pane, as if waiting instruction. The shoes had brought in dust from the unfinished room. Here the polish took it and mapped it. The soles had their signatures, patterns designed in rubber by marketing departments to imply confidence. Mine made a grid of tiny chevrons. The prints I had followed earlier formed ovals with crosshatch. Another set existed, narrower, sharper, the kind left by heels that had taken care walking. The heel prints were faint but not old. They led from one of the right-hand doors to the pane and stopped at the seam. The chevrons overlapped them once, then again, then refused to commit to a direction. Because the part of the mind that studies threat had been allowed to lead for too long, another part asked to narrate. Not comfort, explanation. Not theory, use. It came in small increments, the way conditions reveal function when studied from the edge. Floors like this exist everywhere in buildings, real floors, not superstitions in elevators. Places that hold electrical panels, pumps, thermal storage, the dull heroics of keeping other people's hours smooth. In blueprints, those levels have letters, not numbers. Here, the letter had been stripped and the number installed where tenants couldn't see it. This wasn't a tenant floor at all. It was a maintenance level for something the building could not route through its usual ductwork. A maintenance level for choice.
Superstition keeps 13s off directories because people read numbers and see omens. The architecture here had read people and created a number where no one would look, then carved a space for what decisions break when momentum gets mistaken for meaning. A room for contracts almost signed, for vows rehearsed but not spoken, for exits chosen before exits were granted. The pantry held their artifacts. The pane held their passage. Standing in front of the seam, I pressed my palm lightly to the milky surface. Cold passed through skin, through tendon, into bone. Not the cold of weather, the cold of agency withheld. The pane did not flex. The light behind did not strengthen. But in the instant of contact, the objects on the shelves to my left took on the intensity of things seen rather than things looked at. The ring announced its scuff with pride. The program lifted its stain like a badge. The token declared a plan to cross a river that had been postponed indefinitely. The notch in the shelves repeated itself in the panel to my right. A low pedestal rose from the floor here, not high enough to be an altar, too high to be a step. Its surface was a square of acrylic larger than the others by a ratio that liked symmetry. At the pedestal's front lip, the notch appeared one more time, a suggestion of how to interact, without telling what would happen after obedience. When the hand traced the notch, the square brightened by half a watt and then relented. Weight wanted to be placed there. Not any weight, selected weight. Elevators are for lifting. Stairs are for deciding. This floor had demanded both and provided neither. The hunger in the pedestal was as specific as the hunger in a scale. Install a thing and the room would rebalance. Refuse and the room would let you stand until muscles made treaties with pain. The banking of objects on the shelves had been a clue. Every exit here required an entry fee. Inventory began. Keys, wallet, phone, a receipt folded into a smaller square than paper tolerates, a transit card with a 19-digit number that would not memorize itself, a cheap pen stolen by accident from a desk that had never protested. Choices carry tokens. Pockets are their pantry. Which one had enough story to register as surrender and not enough function to qualify as loss that would undo the rest? The ring in the pantry did not belong to the day I was living, but it had cousins everywhere. The metal circles that people used to remind themselves of promises. I possessed no such circle here. The token would strand me on some later sidewalk. The wallet would shut down ordinary life. The keys would rewrite the notion of home. The transit card would punish future errands for the sake of a principle. The cheap pen had written check-in notes to friends on nights when those notes were required. It had performed maintenance in ink. It had cost nothing and held a lot. The pedestal welcomed that calculation.
The pen went on the square. The acrylic accepted the weight, which was not weight at all, and allowed itself a glow that flowered and then remembered modesty. The elevator behind me exhaled once, a machine acknowledging a status change. The pantry light softened as if the shelves had been fed. On the pane, the seam breathed. It was small, a widening measured in paper thickness, thin enough to believe imagination if the rest of the room had not signed it as receipt. The seam stopped, a beat, then another length, twin to the first. Not an automatic door, a muscle parting and testing the tendon. The building gave way at the pace of consent. Inside the pane waited not a hallway, but an atrium carved from interior volume. The space fell away before it rose. A pit and a shaft married to each other so that either direction was true. The ceiling was not a ceiling, but a repetition of that luminous surface whose source refused to name itself. Balconies circled the void at intervals that looked mathematically correct. Railings framed each level with the same brushed metal as the handles. Along the inside curve of each balcony stood more of the pedestals, fewer objects than places to place them, more notches than visitors. The floor directly before the seam was a bridge, narrow enough that two people would pass each other close enough to feel heat. I stepped onto it because no other motion remained. The soles printed in chevrons. The cross-hatched ovals overlapped. The narrow heel impressions waited at the far edge and drifted down the adjacent stair. An elegant flight that the eye had not registered until encouragement pulled it into focus. The descent here was unlike the descent in the cab. No mechanical lift pressed or buoyed. Gravity negotiated. The rail accepted a palm and gave back temperature that matched skin. The atrium produced its own weather in drafts that moved with the steadiness of logic. At each landing, another pedestal. At each pedestal, another object that I could not reach. They were present as information only. The tokens had been made. The spaces had been reconciled. At the third landing, a panel set into the inner wall displayed diagrams like the laminated cards upstairs, but these had been drawn by hand, traced and retraced until paper had nearly surrendered. The structure of the building appeared simplified to curves and axes, like a child's skeleton drawn for instruction. Floors numbered as expected, stair cores where they should be. Then a band between 12 and 14 shaded in graphite, and labeled with a symbol that the wrist had done instead of the mind. The symbol resembled a door half open. It also resembled a mouth taught to be quiet and caught mid-disobedience. The fourth landing carried a bench for no one. Its surface held the outline of two objects that had once rested there side by side, rectangles the size of phones in cases. The dust on the bench told less story than the dust upstairs. It arranged itself in even coats like a policy. The fifth landing bent the stair inward into a tighter curve. The void below had gathered not darkness, but the color of breath at dawn.
On the sixth, the narrow heel prints left the steps and crossed to a shallow alcove carved like a confession into the inner wall. The alcove contained a door handle without a door, mounted on a plate the size of a small book. Beneath it, a notch. Above it, a tiny, stubborn, light-winking metronome. Touching the handle did nothing useful. Touching the notch told a different truth. The light steadied. Somewhere behind the wall, a relay celebrated its tiny life. The descent ended, not at a floor, but at a platform projecting toward the void. The platform's edge met a final pane, clear this time, and beyond it swam the city. Not the distorted version from the unfinished room, not the angle that lied. Patient, exact, the grid lay there in neon and halogen and tempers. Cars drew red lines where they should. Windows lit offices where overtime argued with home. The pane did not open. It did not need to. The function of a view is to inventory desire. Standing there, the maintenance logic became simple enough to carry without diagrams. Skipped numbers calm tenants more than they calm buildings. Buildings accept the superstition and manufacture a floor to keep what would otherwise leak. Choices aborted mid-gesture, promises that were about to counterfeit themselves, rooms that required a witness instead of an audience. Elevators deny the number because denial is marketing. The architecture puts the number back because physics demands accounting. The pantry holds the tokens. The atrium reconciles the math. The pane does not let anyone jump because this is not punishment. It is storage. Leaving required the reverse of entry. Not complicated, specific. The pen had been accepted as currency because it had written a system for survival on nights like this. A different currency would be required to go back. Something taken that could be given. Something given that could be let go. The platform held a single pedestal. No object rested there. The notch at its lip felt older than the others, worn the way thresholds wear when weather meets them daily. The square waited. The phone had acted as a map until maps became theater. The keys held home together in a way no room should be asked to prove to a building. The wallet was bureaucracy. The receipt, imposter. The transit card still contained rivers to cross that were not metaphors. That left the check-in ritual that had traveled folded inside the body. Nights like the restaurant had taught it, a message to a person who expects to hear it, the maintenance of being known. There is a way to place something you cannot touch. You stand very still and say it inside without words, then put it down in your own arms. The square brightened to acknowledge what the hand could not set on it.
A simple inventory of a practice laid aside. Not forever, long enough to see what balance would become without it. On the surface of the square, condensation formed and then dried without leaving a mark. Above, the atrium adjusted its light. The seam at the lobby closed the length of a breath and opened again. The elevator behind the milky pane chimed once as if learning a new tone. The narrow heel prints that had guided down the stair now doubled back and thinned until they were memory instead of evidence. The platform did not move. The building did.
Later, in an elevator that belonged to a different address, the body felt the half-breath again between numbers that had learned to lie for tenants and tell the truth for architecture. The panel smiled its sequence: 10, 11, 12, 14. The tiny pause between the even and the fiction contained an entire room. The fan made its polite spin. The handrail cooled heat in a line across a palm. Momentum pretended to be meaning and failed to fool. Buildings never wanted to carry our rituals. They do it because we put them there. Somewhere between floors, they keep a place to set them down and measure whether we still need them. Some nights it is a ring. Some nights a ticket. Some nights an entire wedding's rush to be a story. Some nights a seat angled toward a door. Some nights a pen. The best exits have nothing to do with running. They have everything to do with accounting. Maintenance, not spectacle. On a morning after, Shoes left the apartment and found the sidewalk without the paranoia that had tried to rent space in the ribs. The day offered errands unglamorous and sane. The elevator in my own building hummed like normal machinery, eager to do its job. When the doors closed, the mirror returned a person not braver, not wiser, just calibrated. The body remembered the pantry. The mind respected the seam. The number between 12 and 14 kept its secret in public, where everyone could see it and not notice it. In a coat pocket, a different pen found its way against the lining, weight, small, and honest. It would be used to write the little maintenance that keeps people connected when buildings insist on being buildings. It would write check-ins again soon enough. The building had not demanded a vow, it had demanded a pause. It had created a room to let the pause become true.